When we first moved into Lakeview Orchards, I couldn't help but marvel at the picturesque rows of pastel houses surrounding the central pond. We were coming from an older, cramped apartment, lured by the promise of suburban calm and an appealing homeowners association that touted well-kept sidewalks, blooming flower beds, and a strong sense of community spirit. At the time, we felt relief. Our family needed a peaceful place, especially because my younger sister, Diana, had recently been declared legally blind due to a degenerative eye condition. She could still make out vague shapes, but her primary mode of navigation was a newly assigned service animal, an intelligent, gentle Labrador named Harvey. Harvey had been trained meticulously as a guide dog, able to lead Diana around obstacles, signal changes in terrain, and alert her to hazards she couldn't see. Our old apartment building had limited communal areas and was often cluttered with hazards for Diana, so Lakeview Orchards seemed like an oasis of broad sidewalks and easy-to-navigate walkways. We were overjoyed at the prospect of living somewhere that recognized the value of organization and accessibility. Yes, an HOA meant extra rules, but we naively believed everyone would be warm and understanding, especially with a visually impaired resident who relied on a guide dog. Little did we know that behind the pristine landscaping and carefully curated facade lurked an individual with an overblown sense of authority. Even as we settled in, we caught glimpses of Beatrice Arndl, better known as Karen. She was in her late 40s, some guessed early 50s, with immaculate hair swept into a tidy chignon, always dressed in pressed blouses and tailored slacks, even during casual weekend strolls. We saw her walking the streets of Lakeview Orchards, notepad in hand, pausing to peer at each property as though scanning for minute infractions. Despite the occasional comments from neighbors, whispers of, "Be careful with Karen. She runs the HOA with an iron fist," we thought it wouldn't be a problem. We had nothing to hide, after all. Our home was in good condition, we intended to follow community guidelines, and of course we had every right to keep a service dog for Diana's needs. In our naive optimism, we felt secure, sure that even the strictest board member would appreciate the importance of a guide dog. But as time would tell, Karen had a habit of exerting her power in ways that often bordered on harassment. And soon enough, her controlling eye shifted onto Harvey, spurring a conflict we never imagined we'd face, having to defend a trained service animal against draconian, discriminatory rules in our own neighborhood. It was only our second week in Lakeview Orchards when Diana and I took Harvey for a walk around the central pond. The midday sun glittered off the water, and the sidewalks were dotted with neighbors walking dogs or pushing strollers. Harvey, wearing his distinct harness that read, "Guide Dog, Do Not Pet," led Diana carefully along the walkway. I was a step behind her, occasionally offering gentle directions when needed. We were laughing softly about how scenic the place was, especially compared to our old home. That's when we heard a firm, authoritarian voice. "Good afternoon," the voice said, in a tone that implied anything but friendliness. Turning, we saw Beatrice Arndl approaching. She wore a crisp beige blouse, brown slacks, and a serious expression. Even from a distance, her posture and the way she clutched her notepad hinted at an unspoken sense of authority. "Lovely day," I offered politely. She studied Diana and Harvey for a tense moment. "I see you're walking a large dog," she remarked. "I trust you've read our HOA regulations regarding pets." I nodded, trying not to bristle. "Yes, ma'am. We're fully aware. This is a guide dog, specifically trained for my sister, who's visually impaired. The HOA guidelines mention typical leash lengths and cleanliness standards, of course. We always follow those, and he's wearing his harness." Karen pursed her lips. "Well, Lakeview Orchards does allow dogs, but typically under 40 pounds. We don't want them causing property damage. Are you sure the dog meets the weight restriction?" I blinked in surprise. "He's a Labrador, around 65 pounds, but he's a service animal. I believe service animals are exempt from general pet restrictions under both federal and state law. The local ordinance also respects that." Her gaze flicked to Harvey's harness. I'll need to verify that with the board. We strive to maintain a certain standard here. Noise, potential mess, intimidation of neighbors. A large dog, even if it's service, might require special arrangements. You understand." I bit my tongue. "We're well versed in the legal rights of guide dogs, Ms. Arndl. There shouldn't be any confusion about that. He's a trained service animal, not a typical household pet. Her lips pressed into a thin smile. Yes, well, I will check with the board. Good day. With that, she strode off. Diana, having heard the exchange, quietly squeezed my arm. Is she serious? Diana whispered. Guide dogs are protected by law. She can't block me from having Harvey. She can't. Don't worry. I murmured, though my stomach felt uneasy. The brief encounter seemed to hint that Karen had zero intention of giving us the benefit of the doubt. The following week, I discovered a note taped to our mailbox. It bore the HOA letterhead at the top and read, Resident at our address. We would like to remind you that all pets, including special breeds, must comply with local guidelines regarding leashing, waste disposal, and aggression. Additional regulations may apply to large animals, pending approval from the HOA board. Failure to adhere may result in fines. I reread the phrase special breeds, suspecting that was a dig at Harvey. His status as a guide dog, absolutely recognized by the Americans with Disabilities Act, had apparently been reduced to special breed in Karen's vocabulary. No other neighbor with dogs seemed to be receiving such notices. Concerned, I phoned the HOA management office. The representative, a pleasant woman named Paula, seemed uncertain. I'm not aware of any new special breed rules. If your dog is a service animal, standard pet rules about size limits typically don't apply. Did you speak to Ms. Arndel about this? I explained our earlier run-in. Paula sighed. Well, Ms. Arndel is on the board, but she can't unilaterally decide policy. I'd suggest attending the next HOA meeting to clarify. Meanwhile, keep your documentation for the dog's service animal certification in case she tries to press the issue. When I told Diana about the letter, she frowned. I don't get it. Everyone else we've met has been nice. Why is she so fixated on Harvey? Because, I said, she's a controlling person who sees an opportunity to impose some made-up rule. But legally, she can't override the laws protecting service animals. We'll handle it. Still, the note set a tone of unease. As if on cue, Karen began appearing more often whenever we walked Harvey, as if tracking our movements. More notes followed. One day, we found an anonymous typed letter stuffed under our door, claiming that large dogs can be a nuisance, dangerous to children or the elderly. Another day, while Diana tried to practice walking to the mailbox alone with Harvey guiding her, Karen actually stepped in front of them, remarking, "Remember to keep the dog in check." The constant intrusion made me furious. I started keeping a folder, each note, each instance, times and dates. In the back of my mind, I recalled from my research that any attempts to restrict a legitimate service dog's presence might be considered disability discrimination. If Karen escalated, I'd have evidence. Over the next few weeks, Karen's attempts to police Harvey's presence grew bolder and more blatantly discriminatory. Once, she intercepted us at the community clubhouse's main entrance. It was a sunny afternoon, and Diana wanted to attend a neighborhood crafting group that met in the clubhouse lounge. She carefully took Harvey's harness, and he led her up the ramp to the door. Karen positioned herself just inside, arms folded, addressing me more than Diana. I'm afraid we have a no animals policy in the clubhouse, except for certain events, she announced coldly. I blinked in disbelief. But this is a guide dog. That's explicitly allowed by law. Service animals can accompany their handlers wherever the public can go. That includes communal clubhouses. Karen raised an eyebrow. We have to ensure the clubhouse remains sanitary. We can't have a large dog wandering around. Our events typically require a calm environment, and we can't risk allergic reactions or fear from other attendees. Diana's hands trembled. Harvey is specifically trained not to disrupt others. He's calm, well-behaved, and I need him to navigate. Karen didn't yield. We might consider letting him in if you had prior approval. But as of now, this is unexpected. I need to consult the board or at least gather the correct paperwork to ensure it's safe. This is a violation of disability law, I said, struggling to stay composed. Service dogs are permitted in public and common areas. We don't need prior approval. That's not how it works. If you forcibly bar him, you're breaking the law, Ms. Arndel. Her eyes narrowed. No need for dramatics. I'm simply ensuring compliance with our guidelines. I'll let you pass this time, but do expect we'll require official forms soon. My blood boiled. This was no minor oversight. She was effectively telling us we needed special permission to bring a recognized guide dog into an otherwise public part of the community. The tension in the air was palpable as Diana and I brushed past her, hearts pounding with indignation. I made a mental note to document every detail of this interaction. We'd suspected discrimination. Now we had a glaring incident. After that clubhouse standoff, Karen's scrutiny intensified. She began peppering us with demands for proof of training, health certificates, and even an HOA compliance form that she claimed all special breed owners had to fill out. None of these demands aligned with actual legal requirements for a service animal. The ADA states that businesses or property managers can only ask two questions: if the dog is a service animal required because of a disability, and what task the dog is trained to perform. They can't require certification papers or ID cards, especially not in housing situations. But Karen seemed either ignorant of these laws or willfully ignoring them. In a letter that appeared in our mailbox, again with HOA letterhead, though it might have been typed by Karen herself, she wrote, "Pursuant to ongoing concerns about large animals in Lakeview orchards, we request you provide a detailed account of your dog's breed, training institution, immunization records, and any other relevant documents. Failure to comply could result in review by the board." I felt outraged. It was one thing to ensure a pet had updated vaccines, which is standard for many communities, but she was pushing for detailed training logs, breed specification, and so forth, well beyond normal. For an ordinary pet, some of these demands would be intrusive but possibly not illegal. But for a service animal, it veered into discriminatory territory, basically ignoring the special rights guaranteed by federal law. Diana tried to keep calm, focusing on her daily life and relying on Harvey's assistance. Yet each time we left the house, heading to the grocery store, the doctor, or even a casual walk, she dreaded encountering Karen's disapproving stare. If Karen wasn't physically confronting us, she was lurking around corners or driving slowly past our home, as though hoping to catch us in some contravention. Harvey, in his gentle innocence, remained unfazed. He trotted with confidence, guiding Diana carefully. His stoic presence became a comforting reminder that we were on the right side of both morality and law. If Karen persisted, we'd have no choice but to push back in a serious, formal manner. And that moment was coming sooner than expected. Realizing that Karen's actions could escalate, I decided to confide in some neighbors. Over coffee one morning, I spoke to Harriet, an older resident who had lived in Lakeview orchards for nearly a decade. Harriet wasn't on the board, but she attended meetings regularly and knew the local politics intimately. She listened sympathetically to the saga and shook her head. Beatrice, everyone calls her Karen, by the way, has a history of overstepping. She tried to ban teens from skateboarding near the pond, even though the sidewalk is public. She once demanded the board limit who could have solar panels on the roofs. She thrives on controlling everything. Harriet sighed. But messing with a service dog, that's a new low. The rest of the board typically tries to keep her in check, but she's quite persuasive. Still, if you let them know she's harassing your sister with a genuine guide dog, I believe they'll side with you, especially if you cite the legal issues. I nodded, relieved. We'll need to bring this up at the next HOA board meeting, I guess. She's already threatened to review our dog. Are there any other members who might help us? Harriet suggested I speak to the HOA's vice president, a man named Mr. Wilson, who was known to be more moderate than Karen. He's a stickler for certain rules, but he's also conscientious about following actual law. Approach him directly, show the harassment. That afternoon, I compiled all the notes and letters, listing each instance in a timeline. I included references to the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Fair Housing Act, and any relevant state laws on service animals. Then I wrote a polite but firm email to Mr. Wilson, explaining the repeated intrusions, the misguided demands for special breed compliance, and the day Karen tried to bar us from the clubhouse. I attached scans of the letters as proof. To my relief, Mr. Wilson replied within 48 hours, thanking me for bringing the matter to his attention. He confirmed that no official new rules about special breed or large service dog had ever been approved. He said the board would investigate. That gave me hope that Karen was acting unilaterally, not with the board's blessing. Still, the real challenge lay ahead, ensuring Karen faced accountability for her discriminatory behavior. Even if the board sided with us, would it curb her meddling? Or would she ramp up the intimidation? Soon, An agenda for the upcoming HOA board meeting circulated via email. Among the items, discussion of service animal protocol. My heart pounded reading it, suspecting that Karen insisted the board address her new demands. But it also meant we'd have a chance to present our side publicly. Diana was nervous about attending. She disliked confrontations and felt anxious in crowds due to her visual impairment. However, Harriet volunteered to sit with her, guiding her to a comfortable seat. Meanwhile, I would be prepared to speak, armed with the documentation and references to disability law. I also planned to bring a few neighbors who'd witnessed Karen's harassment or found it disturbing. The night of the meeting arrived. The community clubhouse buzzed with tension. More people than usual showed up, likely because word spread about the guide dog issue. The board members sat at a long table in front. Mr. Wilson, the treasurer Ms. Clark, a couple of other members, and of course, Karen. She wore a formal blazer, a tidy stack of papers in front of her. I spotted a faint smirk on her lips when she glanced my way, as though confident in her stance. After some preliminary business about landscaping and budget updates, Mr. Wilson cleared his throat. Next item, service animal protocol. We have a formal complaint regarding alleged harassment of a homeowner's guide dog. We'll also hear from Ms. Arndl about her concerns. Karen was the first to speak. She launched into a prepared spiel about maintaining community standards, claiming that unusual and large animals could cause fear or pose safety hazards. She insisted she was simply acting on behalf of concerned residents who worried about property damage, noise, or unpredictability of big dogs. She peppered her language with disclaimers like, "I fully respect the disabled, of course, but we must ensure everyone feels secure." I clenched my fists under the table, biting back retorts until she finished. Mr. Wilson then called me forward. With a steady voice, I explained that Harvey was a trained guide dog, recognized under both the ADA and state law. I recounted how Karen tried to block us from the clubhouse, demanded extraneous paperwork, and used letters that implied we needed special approval for a service animal. I read a short excerpt from federal guidelines. Individuals with disabilities shall be permitted to be accompanied by their service animals in all areas of a place of public accommodation. That included an HOA's communal facilities. At the end, I concluded, Ms. Arndl's actions constitute harassment and possibly discrimination, as she's imposing burdens on a recognized service animal that no law or HOA bylaw supports. We're asking the board to acknowledge that my sister's guide dog is fully entitled to be here, with no extra conditions attached. A hush fell over the room. Some neighbors in the audience murmured their agreement. Diana, sitting beside Harriet, looked anxious yet hopeful. Just as I thought we might see progress, Karen's face hardened. She whipped out a folder of her own. "I have concerns from multiple neighbors," she claimed. "Some have allergies. Others have expressed fear over large dogs that can jump on them or bark. We do not want Lakeview Orchards to become a place where residents feel threatened." She slammed the folder on the table, but refused to show the complaints to anyone. Someone from the audience asked, "Have these alleged complainants spoken to the homeowner?" "Because we've never seen the dog misbehave." Karen deflected. They wished to remain anonymous to avoid conflict. It was a classic tactic, conjure anonymous statements to justify her stance. Mr. Wilson frowned, turning to her. "Even if that were true, Ms. Arndl, the presence of allergies or fear does not override the rights of someone who needs a service dog. We must abide by legal standards." Karen bristled. "I'm not trying to break the law. I'm seeking a balanced approach. Perhaps the dog could remain in certain designated areas, or we could schedule times for it to be in the clubhouse. That way, those with allergies or phobias can avoid it." An older woman in the audience stood up, voice quavering. "My grandson has mild allergies, but he knows to keep distance if he sees a dog. Why on earth would we confine a service dog or treat it like it's some optional accessory? This young woman needs it. That's no small matter." Karen shot the woman a cold look. "We can't base policy on sentiment alone. We have to consider every homeowner's comfort." At that point, Harriet spoke, pointing to the actual bylaws. "Nowhere in these documents does it say a service dog requires special restrictions. In fact, it references compliance with applicable state and federal regulations. That means you cannot implement extra rules for a legitimate service animal. You're making up these demands, Ms. Arndl, and it's borderline harassment." Karen's face reddened, but she remained defiant. This association has the right to uphold a standard. If that standard necessitates stricter guidelines for unusual animals, so be it. I clenched my jaw. The confrontation was tense. Mr. Wilson finally proposed they table the matter for further legal review. But I wasn't content to let Karen carry on this crusade. I quietly resolved to escalate beyond the HOA if needed. She was flirting with disability discrimination. If the board didn't rein her in, I would have to file a formal complaint. After the meeting, Harriet and a few neighbors gathered with me outside the clubhouse. They shook their heads in disbelief at Karen's stubbornness. She never quits, does she? Harriet muttered. Even when the rest of the board hints she's out of line. I nodded, feeling the beginnings of real exasperation. The board is going to review legal aspects, but Karen's stalling. Meanwhile, she might keep harassing us daily. Diana stressed out. She shouldn't have to worry about being challenged every time she and Harvey step outside. One of the neighbors, an older gentleman named Brian, chimed in. You might consider filing a complaint with the local Fair Housing Authority or a disability rights group. If it's an HOA, they can't override the ADA or Fair Housing Act. This is definitely discrimination. I realized that might be the next logical step. I already had a folder full of documentation. The question was whether I wanted to escalate. Diana felt uneasy about it, fearing we'd become pariahs if we brought legal action. But we both knew we had a right to protect her interests. A service dog wasn't a whim. It was essential for her independence. That weekend, I spent hours reading about the Fair Housing Act, FHA, and how it prohibits housing providers, including HOAs, from discriminating against individuals with disabilities, including refusing reasonable accommodations for service animals. While the ADA primarily addressed public accommodations, the FHA applied strongly to housing situations. Karen's attempts to corral Harvey under pet policies or impose extra conditions directly clashed with that law. So I gathered everything. Letters from the HOA, all the petty notes referencing special breed, the email from Paula, the HOA staffer, confirming no real rule for service dogs existed, and even the personal recollections of neighbors who saw Karen's clubhouse confrontation. If Karen insisted on continuing this harassment, I'd have enough evidence to file an official disability discrimination complaint with the relevant authorities. Diana, for her part, tried to stay calm, focusing on her daily routine with Harvey. But I could see the toll it took, fear that Karen would appear from behind a hedge to scold them, or that we might face a sudden, unjust fine. Enough was enough. If the board didn't put an end to it promptly, we'd take it outside the neighborhood's bubble. Though the board said they would review the matter, Karen continued sending us letters. One particularly galling missive arrived on a Tuesday, typed in a formal style. Dear resident, in light of ongoing concerns regarding your large service dog, the HOA advises you to refrain from bringing this animal to communal spaces, clubhouse, pool areas, etc., until a full resolution is reached. We are also requiring documentation of the dog's training credentials and breed specifics for board approval. Noncompliance could result in fines or other actions. I read it twice, incredulous at how brazen it was. She was basically commanding us to keep Harvey away from any communal space, ignoring the fact that no board vote supported this, let alone the law. This was the last straw. If the board didn't step in to repudiate Karen's letter, I'd have no choice but to file a formal complaint for discrimination. I emailed Mr. Wilson, forwarding the letter. This is unacceptable. She can't bar a service dog from communal areas. Please confirm whether this reflects the HOA's official stance, or is Ms. Arndl acting alone again? He replied 2 days later, apologizing and stating that no official ban existed. He promised to bring it up with the full board immediately. But that wasn't enough. Karen was still brandishing the HOA's name to intimidate us. Diana was understandably upset, worrying that if she took Harvey anywhere near the clubhouse or pool lounge, Karen might confront her publicly. We discussed it with Harriet, who insisted we should go about our normal activities and dare Karen to escalate. Harriet even offered to accompany Diana as a witness if needed. Yet, the emotional toll was high. Each walk or errand felt overshadowed by the possibility of Karen's interference. Diana's self-confidence in navigating the neighborhood was undermined. And that, more than anything, drove me to act. The next morning, I started drafting a formal complaint about disability discrimination, planning to send it to both our local fair housing office and the state's civil rights division. If the board wouldn't muzzle Karen, the law would. Compiling the complaint was both exhausting and empowering. I enumerated the specific incidents. The mailbox notes labeling Harvey a special breed, subject to extra scrutiny. Karen's clubhouse confrontation, where she tried to block Harvey from entering, demanding training records and special breed compliance. Letters implying we were forbidden from bringing Harvey to communal spaces until approval. I stated that these actions constituted unlawful discrimination under the Fair Housing Act and possibly the ADA, as Karen was acting in an official capacity on behalf of the HOA. I attached copies of her letters, screenshots of emails, quotes from neighbors who witnessed her remarks. It was a thick packet of evidence. Then I drafted a cover letter explaining that we'd attempted to resolve the matter internally, but Karen persisted. I requested a formal investigation and any relief the authorities deemed appropriate, including a directive for the HOA to cease discriminatory practices. My heart raced as I sealed the envelope, addressed it to the relevant state civil rights office, and placed it in the mail. I also emailed a digital copy to the local fair housing organization. Diana was supportive, though anxious about potential backlash. I reassured her that the law was clear. Service animals can't be singled out by an HOA. If anyone had backlash, it would likely be Karen, forced to defend her unwarranted restrictions. Harriet and other neighbors cheered the step. It's time someone stood up to her, Harriet insisted. Still, I felt a swirl of apprehension. We'd taken a big leap. Once the complaint was in motion, we couldn't easily retract it. Our relationship with the HOA might be permanently changed, but I saw no alternative. Karen's relentless harassment had to end. Barely a week after I mailed the complaint, we received word that the local fair housing office sent a letter to the HOA board, informing them of the pending discrimination investigation. Mr. Wilson called me, his voice tense. I understand you filed a complaint with the state. We just got the notice. Listen, I can't say I blame you, but the board is blindsided. Ms. Arndl never got official approval for her letters. We're going to convene an emergency meeting to address this. I thanked him, feeling both vindicated and uneasy. At last, the rest of the board would realize the gravity of Karen's actions. Harriet told me that rumors swirled among the board members. Some were furious that Karen had acted so unilaterally, potentially dragging the entire HOA into a legal nightmare. Others felt we should have tried once more to reason with the board. But I stood by our decision. We'd tried reason repeatedly. The emergency meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening. This time, the mood was starkly different. People seemed worried. The threat of a fair housing investigation was no joke, as it could result in fines or legal obligations for the HOA. When the meeting started, Mr. Wilson read from the official notice. The complaint alleges discriminatory policies toward a service animal. The investigating authority has requested documentation. We have to respond thoroughly. He cast a hard look at Karen, who sat stiffly, arms crossed. Karen tried to defend herself, claiming she was only responding to numerous complaints. But Mr. Wilson cut her off. We have no record of these numerous complaints in official board minutes, Ms. Arndl. You took it upon yourself to issue letters. If that's so, you alone bear responsibility for these actions that may violate federal and state law. She sputtered. I was protecting our community from potential risk. A large dog can cause accidents, especially around the elderly or children. Doesn't that matter? Mr. Wilson shook his head. You have no evidence the dog is aggressive or uncontrolled. The law requires us to accommodate a guide dog. End of story. Another board member, Ms. Clark, added, your letters implied the HOA had a policy that we never voted on. That's misleading, to say the least. Harriet, seated in the audience, stood up to address the board. I've witnessed Ms. Arndl repeatedly target the guide dog. This is not about safety, it's about personal bias. We can't let that tarnish Lakeview Orchard's reputation. A few neighbors clapped softly. Cornered, Karen pursed her lips, but the usual defiance in her eyes faltered. She must have realized the board was not backing her. Mr. Wilson concluded the session by stating, we'll comply with the fair housing investigation. Meanwhile, any attempts to bar or restrict the guide dog must stop immediately. Ms. Arndl, you are instructed to refrain from contacting that family unless absolutely necessary for normal HOA matters. In a rare display of humility, The board decided to hold a special public forum the next week, presumably to quell the growing sense of scandal. Word around the neighborhood was that the board demanded Karen publicly acknowledge her error and disclaim any new special breed policy she had circulated. They hoped to show good faith to the investigating authorities. I brought Diana along to the forum, though she was nervous. Harriet and several other sympathetic neighbors joined us. The small clubhouse was packed. Likely half the community came, curious about how the guide dog fiasco would be resolved. Mr. Wilson opened the forum, summarizing how Lakeview Orchards wholeheartedly welcomed residents with disabilities, recognized the law protecting service animals, and that the HOA had no intention of restricting them. Then he motioned for Karen to come forward. Karen stepped to the front. She gripped a piece of paper in her hands, eyes scanning the crowd. For a moment, I almost felt a pang of sympathy. She looked rattled, out of her element. But then I recalled the months of stress she'd inflicted on us. Her voice trembled slightly as she read. To the residents of Lakeview Orchards, and specifically to the family at our address, I apologize for any confusion or distress caused by my letters regarding the guide dog. I acknowledge that I acted without proper board authorization and that service animals are protected by law. I regret any inconvenience and will comply with all applicable regulations and the board's directives. The room was silent. Harriet whispered to Diana, "She sounds almost sincere." But I wasn't convinced. Karen's expression remained one of resentment, as though she was forced to speak these words. Nonetheless, it was a victory, a public apology and confession that she'd overstepped. Mr. Wilson concluded by reiterating that the HOA recognized the importance of service animals and would not hinder them in communal areas. He then thanked me for bringing the matter to their attention. Some neighbors applauded politely. Others wore expressions of relief or mild embarrassment for the community's sake. Privately, after the forum, Mr. Wilson told me the board had formally reprimanded Karen. They'd even threatened to remove her from certain committees if she continued harassing residents or ignoring legal standards. He seemed genuinely regretful that it had escalated to a fair housing complaint. I assured him it wasn't personal against the entire board, but we had to protect Diana's rights. Diana felt a massive weight lift. For the first time in months, she strolled with Harvey to the clubhouse lounge without dread, greeting neighbors who were more than happy to see the calm Labrador at her side. A few neighbors who had previously been distant even approached to show support, apologizing for Karen's hostility. The atmosphere shifted, making Lakeview Orchards feel more welcoming again. The official investigation by the Fair Housing Office continued for a while, though it eventually ended with the HOA sending a statement clarifying that Karen's attempts did not represent official policy and that the board had taken corrective measures. The investigating agency closed the case without imposing fines, presumably satisfied that the HOA had reversed Karen's discriminatory conduct and apologized. We, meanwhile, celebrated quietly. The threat to Harvey's presence was gone, and we felt safer. I stored my thick folder of documentation, hoping we'd never need it again. The bond between Diana and Harvey remained strong, unaffected by all the drama. Karen's outward attitude changed drastically after her public reprimand. Gone was the confident board member who strode the neighborhood with a notepad. In her place was a subdued, sometimes visibly resentful woman. She still held her seat on the board. She hadn't resigned, but she rarely spoke up in meetings or tried to enforce petty rules. It was as if the entire fiasco had stripped away her sense of invulnerability. Occasionally, we'd catch a glimpse of her passing by our house, pointedly looking away from us and from Harvey. If we encountered her while walking, she'd avert her gaze. The air was thick with awkwardness. Some neighbors said she complained behind closed doors, calling the apology unfair, but she no longer dared to act on it publicly. In a strange twist, her lost moral high ground seemed to overshadow her influence on other HOA matters. Harriet told me that the board now second-guessed any of Karen's proposals, always asking if they might violate some regulation or cause undue hardship. She'd effectively undermined her own authority by picking a fight with a guide dog. From our perspective, the relief was palpable. Diana resumed her routine, confidently exploring the neighborhood with Harvey. She joined the crafting group in the clubhouse every Thursday and strolled around the pond whenever she pleased. Freed from Karen's oppressive shadow, She regained the sense of autonomy so essential to living with a visual impairment. As months passed, Lakeview Orchards returned to the peaceful place we'd envisioned when we moved in. The shrubs blossomed in the spring sunshine, neighbors hosted barbecues around the pond, and children played on the small community playground. The official drama seemed a distant memory, though in a neighborhood like this, small disputes always lurked beneath the surface. For Diana and Harvey, life carried on unimpeded. Harvey guided her along the sidewalks, expertly stopping at curbs, weaving around obstacles. She grew more confident, venturing further from home without me. The meltdown over the special breed had proven that no matter how fervently one meddling individual tried, they couldn't extinguish the legal protections and rightful place of a service dog. Karen, after her forced apology, never tried to enforce any new dog rules. She occasionally posted mild suggestions in the HOA newsletter about cleaning up after pets or keeping them leashed, but never again singled out special breeds or demanded extra paperwork. Her overreach had been firmly slapped down. Meanwhile, the official final outcome of the complaint was essentially a letter from the Fair Housing Office acknowledging the HOA's corrective actions. No further legal action was taken. We considered that an acceptable resolution. Our main goal was always just to ensure Diana's rights were upheld and that harassment ended. In that sense, we prevailed. Life in Lakeview Orchards isn't perfect. No suburban community is. But the once looming threat from Karen receded to a mere footnote, overshadowed by neighbors who recognized the importance of dignity and accessibility for all. Diana flourishes, continuing her daily tasks with Harvey at her side. The sleek black lab remains unruffled by the past conflict, ever focused on his job, guiding, protecting, and offering unconditional companionship. And in those calm evenings, when I watch Diana stroke Harvey's soft ears, whispering thanks for another day navigated with independence, I feel a rush of gratitude. We overcame petty tyranny by standing firm, armed with the law and the truth. Karen's attempt to regulate a guide dog, a shining example of unwavering service, only revealed the depths of her misguided sense of power. But in the end, that power crumbled under the weight of rightful justice.